All right, so get this. We're diving into the murder of Carol Kennedy, and wow, this case is wild.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here.
Tons of twists and turns, right? You guys send in a lot on this one, so.
Absolutely. And what makes this case so interesting is there's no like smoking gun, you know?
Yeah.
It's all circumstantial evidence and motives and conflicting accounts.
So let's set the scene. It's July 2nd, 2008, in Prescott, Arizona, and Carol Kennedy is found murdered in her home.
Brutal scene.
7 skull fractures.
Yeah.
Blood everywhere, but no fingerprints, no bloody footprints, and the murder weapon is missing.
It's a real mystery right from the start.
So where do investigators even begin with a case like this?
Well, they had to rely on piecing together the circumstances surrounding Carol's life and death.
Right.
Like a puzzle with missing pieces. So let's talk about those pieces. One of the first pieces is her ex-husband, Steve Demarker.
Yeah.
They had this really contentious divorce, right? There were allegations of infidelity on Steve's part, and their finances were a mess.
And then you have Jim Knapp.
Okay. He was a friend of Carol's. He was living in her guest house.
Oh, interesting.
There were rumors he might have been romantically interested in her.
Okay, so we've got a potential love triangle.
Potentially, yeah.
And from the beginning, investigators focused on Steve.
Yeah, the prosecution zeroed in on him as their main suspect.
Why is that?
Well, for one, he had some financial problems. There were life insurance policies on Carol. And get this, they found internet searches he'd made about how to make a death look like a suicide.
Wait, hold on. Internet searches? I mean, we all go down internet rabbit holes sometimes, don't we? How much weight can you really put on that?
That's a good point. It's definitely debatable. The defense actually argued that those searches were months old and completely unrelated to Carol's death.
Okay.
They said Steve was a writer working on a novel,
Oh, interesting.
and the searches were just for research.
Oh.
His sister even backed him up on that, who said he had always wanted to write.
But you can see why investigators would be suspicious, right? Especially when you consider that Steve was seen near Carol's house around the time of the murder.
Right, and he even had scratches on his body.
And let's not forget about that missing golf club.
Yeah, authorities suspected that a club from Steve's bag might have been the murder weapon, but they never found it.
If they had found that golf club, would the whole case have been different?
It's hard to say, but it definitely raises a lot of questions.
Absolutely. Now let's go back to Jim Knapp, the friend living in the guest house. He had an alibi for the night of the murder, but then 5 months later, he's found dead.
Ruled a suicide.
So now we have 2 deaths connected to Carol, and Steve is looking more and more suspicious.
But there was one group of people who never doubted Steve, his daughters.
Right. They always maintained his innocence.
They said he was a loving father even after the divorce.
That adds another layer to this whole story, makes you wonder if they could really be so wrong about their own father.
It's definitely a question that lingers throughout the whole case.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the first trial. It actually ended in a mistrial because the judge got sick.
But during the delay, things took a wild turn.
This is where Steve's girlfriend, Renee Girard, comes in, right?
Yes. She told investigators that Steve was terrified of being arrested, and he was planning to run away.
Oh, wow.
She even described a go bag he had packed.
This is getting juicy.
And there's more. She also revealed that Steve had told his daughters to transfer the entire life insurance payout, $750,000, to his defense attorneys.
Wait, so his lawyer had initially claimed he wasn't interested in the money?
Yeah, it seemed pretty incriminating.
Sure.
The defense tried to argue that he was just making sure he had good lawyers, but the prosecution saw it as a possible attempt to hide a financial motive.
Okay, so we've got a mistrial. A girlfriend turning on her ex and questions about this life insurance money.
And then just when you think it can't get any crazier, an anonymous email appears.
What?
Yeah, this email was sent to both the prosecution and the defense, claiming to have information about Carol's murder. And it pointed the finger at Jim Knapp, suggesting he was involved in some kind of drug ring. But get this, it turned out that Steve had actually asked his own daughter, Charlotte, to send that email.
Wow, using your own daughter to send a fake email? That's messed up.
It's a really strange twist. It seems like a desperate attempt to shift blame.
Yeah.
But it also raises questions about Charlotte's involvement and why she believed in her father's innocence so strongly.
Okay, so we've got this tangled web of relationships and motives, and then there's the DNA evidence. Remember how there was no physical evidence linking Steve to the crime scene?
Right.
Well, they did find some unknown DNA under Carol's fingernails.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me they finally figured out whose DNA it was.
They did. But it belonged to a man whose autopsy had been performed on the same table just before Carol's.
Are you serious? So the crime scene was potentially contaminated from the start.
That's exactly what the defense argued. They said this compromised the entire investigation and could have obscured the real killer.
So now we're left wondering if the DNA evidence was unreliable. What does that mean for the whole case? Did they have the wrong guy all along?
It's a question that hung over the entire second trial.
So we've covered a lot here: a potential love triangle, a missing golf club, a shady email, and contaminated DNA.
And that's just the beginning. We still need to talk about the second trial, the verdict, and the questions that remain to this day.
Stay tuned, because after a quick break, we'll be right back to delve into the heart of the legal battle and what this case tells us about justice, truth, and the elusiveness of certainty. So we left off with this bombshell about the DNA evidence being potentially contaminated.
Right, it really throws a wrench into things.
So how did the prosecution try to recover from that in the second trial? Did they try to find more physical evidence?
Well, they kind of shifted gears. Instead of focusing so heavily on the physical evidence, they tried to build a case around Steve's character.
Okay, so they're basically saying, even if we can't definitively prove he did it, he's the kind of guy who could.
Yeah, you could say that they wanted to portray him as someone capable of murder someone who had both the motive and the opportunity.
So how did they go about doing that?
Well, they brought in some witnesses who could shed light on Steve's personality and his behavior. One key witness was his business partner and lover, Barbara Bonan.
Oh, right. She testified in the first trial, too.
Yeah, and her testimony was pretty damaging. She talked about spending the night with Steve just days before Carol's murder and how he was still in contact with Carol, even though he claimed they were no longer together.
So they're trying to paint him as a liar, a manipulator, someone who's leading a double life.
Exactly. They wanted the jury to see him as someone who was juggling relationships and maybe even had a reason to want Carol out of the picture.
But what about the defense? Didn't they try to shift the focus back to Jim Knapp? I mean, he had a history of intimidating women.
They did try to bring up Knap again. They called his ex-girlfriend to the stand, and she testified that she had been afraid of him after they broke up.
But Knapp had an alibi, right? And he's dead. It's hard to build a case against someone who can't defend themselves.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. The defense was trying to suggest that maybe Knap was the real killer, but it was an uphill battle.
So it really becomes a question of whose story is more believable, right? It's like this legal chess match.
Exactly. And in the end, the jury sided with the prosecution.
After all that, even with the doubts about the DNA and no murder weapon, they found Steve guilty.
Yeah, after 3 days of deliberation, they found him guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow, that's a huge decision to make. How did the judge react to the verdict?
Well, during sentencing, he was pretty clear about his feelings. He said the crime scene photos were seared into his memory.
I can't even imagine.
He talked about how brutal the murder was and how the motive seemed clear to him: money.
So he believed Steve was guilty.
It certainly seemed that way. And in the end, Steve was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Life in prison? That's a heavy sentence, especially considering all the unknowns in this case.
And throughout it all, Steve has maintained his innocence. His daughters have never wavered in their support for him.
It's a heartbreaking situation for them. They lost their mother, and now their father is in prison for her murder, a crime they believe he didn't commit.
It really makes you think about the impact this case has had on everyone involved.
It goes way beyond just the legal proceedings. It's about families, relationships, and the search for truth when the lines are so blurred.
And that brings us to the heart of it. What can we learn from this deep dive into the Carol Kennedy case? What does it tell us about truth and justice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have a verdict, but does that mean we have the truth? I'm not so sure.
This case really exposes the limitations of our justice system. You know, it relies on human judgment. We all know humans can make mistakes.
So even with a guilty verdict, there's still room for doubt.
Absolutely. And that's something we should all keep in mind as we think about this case and others like it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much to unpack. We need to talk about the ethical considerations, the role of the media, and the long-term effects of this case on everyone involved.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so after all that, after diving deep into all the details of the Carol Kennedy case, I gotta say, I'm still left with this nagging feeling like we're missing something, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those cases that sticks with you. It's not a clean-cut story.
Right. We've got this guy, Steve Demarker, in prison, convicted of this brutal murder, but there's no murder weapon. The DNA evidence is shaky at best. And then there's Jim Knapp, who could have been a suspect, but he's dead, so we can't even question him.
And that's what makes it so compelling, right? It really forces you to think about what constitutes proof. What does beyond a reasonable doubt actually mean?
Exactly, because on the surface, it seems like an open and shut case. The ex-husband had a motive and some questionable behavior, but when you dig deeper, you start to see all these cracks in the story.
It makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where someone might be behind bars based on evidence that could be interpreted in different ways.
It's a bit unsettling, honestly. It makes you question the whole system.
It definitely highlights the fact that our justice system is far from perfect. It's all based on human judgment, and humans make mistakes.
So even with a guilty verdict, there's still a possibility that the wrong person is in prison.
There's always that possibility, and that's why cases like this are so important to examine. We have to be willing to question everything, to look at all sides of the story.
Okay, so let me ask you this straight up. If you were on that jury, knowing everything we know now, could you say with absolute certainty that Steve Demarker murdered Carol Kennedy?
Honestly, I don't think I could. There are just too many unanswered questions,
Yeah.
too many doubts.
So what do we do with that uncertainty? How do we reconcile the fact that a man is in prison, but we may never know for sure if he's actually guilty?
That's the tough part. I think it comes down to accepting that ambiguity, that there are some things we may never know for sure.
But doesn't that feel a bit unsatisfying?
It can, but it's also a reminder to stay curious, to keep asking questions, and to never stop searching for the truth, even when it seems impossible to find.
I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners, too. Don't just accept what you're told. Do your own research, think critically, and form your own opinions.
And don't be afraid to change your mind if new evidence comes to light or if you hear a different perspective.
This case is a perfect example of that. There's so much information out there, and it's up to each of us to sift through it all and decide what we believe.
The Carol Kennedy case isn't just about a murder. It's about the limits of our knowledge, the complexities of the justice system, and the importance of constantly questioning the world around us.
So to all our listeners out there, keep digging, keep exploring, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Because the truth is out there somewhere, even if it's buried under layers of doubt and uncertainty.
And who knows, maybe someday new evidence will come to light in this case and we'll have to revisit it with fresh eyes.
That's the beauty of true crime. It's always evolving. And that's it for this deep dive into the Carol Kennedy case. Thanks for joining us. And remember, keep questioning everything.